Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Epic Human Podcast. I'm your host, Joe Blair, and thank you so much for listening today. The Epic Human Podcast is a long-form podcast featuring risk-takers and high performers from all walks of life, including founders, venture investors, innovators, technologists, artists, athletes, you name it. This podcast was inspired by a series of conversations I recorded with my grandmother, Eileen, before she passed away. These conversations helped me fully appreciate the power of the human voice and the importance of capturing each of our unique stories in the brief time we have on this planet. By doing so, these stories and lessons can live on beyond us and benefit our descendants and the wider future generations. Trippy, I know, but it's true if you think about it. If you'd like to hear Eileen's story, you can read the article I wrote on Medium titled Why I Started the Epic Human Podcast. Quick update on me. I've joined a new investment firm called Coda Capital. I decided to leave my previous firm over this past summer and really wanted to take time to figure out what was next for me. So that's why I wasn't recording podcasts for a little while. Wasn't sure if I wanted to stay in venture or join a startup or do something totally different. But then I met the folks at Coda and I was really impressed. Coda Capital is a stage-agnostic investment firm uniquely investing in both private startups and public companies. The whole idea is that insights gleaned from the public markets help inform the venture strategy and vice versa. We invest broadly in enterprise B2B type companies, and I'll be focused primarily on Series A and B investments. The team's made up of deeply experienced operators, talented investors, technologists, and down-to-earth human beings. So I'm super excited about this new chapter and wanted to share this news with you all. And it's important for me to mention that the views expressed in this podcast and all podcasts are my own and do not represent those of my employer or any organization I'm affiliated with. Today's episode features James Wells, my good friend for many years. James is currently the Vice President of Corporate Development at Sanctuary AI, a company building and scaling embodied artificial general intelligence. In this episode, James and I discuss the differences between various types of AI and opine about the future of the relationship between humans and intelligent machines. And if you thought James was a one-trick pony, you would be mistaken. James is an accomplished survivalist, yogi, Ironman, and meditator. Throughout the course of this episode, we're going to cover James's highly unique experiences, including completing a wilderness survival course in the middle of nowhere, Utah, running an Ironman race, and doing almost no traditional training. And by traditional training, I mean the whole running, biking, swimming thing. And learning and struggling through his meditation practice and the impact it's had on his personal and professional life. So it's a wide-ranging episode. We cover a lot of different topics, but I promise you it's all engaging and quite unique. This episode was also stitched together over a series of recorded conversations that we had, and the final product, I think, is exceptional. And I really think almost anyone could get something out of our chat. Also wanted to mention that today's episode is, again, brought to you by SBZ Legal, a boutique law firm out of Oakland, California that specializes in working with early-stage growth startups. As I've discussed earlier, as an investor, I've witnessed firsthand one of the most important decisions entrepreneurs make is choosing the right legal partner for their business. One common assumption is that a good lawyer is expensive. And so lots of entrepreneurs DIY their legal needs or end up paying thousands of dollars per hour for an attorney's time. But it doesn't have to be that way. SBZ Legal specializes in working with early-stage startups. The firm was founded by 3 Berkeley alum with the idea that business can be a tool for positive change. They focus on helping impact-driven organizations with forming businesses, fundraising, hiring people, closing deals with customers, and protecting their intellectual property. Not only does SBZ Legal take pride in doing high-quality work, they're also transparent about pricing, and they don't charge an arm and a leg, which is important when you're an early-stage startup. You can learn more about SBZ at sbzlegal.com, or you can contact them at info@sbzlegal.com. If you'd like to drop by and say hello, their address is 1939 Harrison Street, Suite 610, Oakland, California, 94612. And I'm legally required to say that this may be considered attorney advertising. And if you happen to reach out to them, please mention you came via the Epic Human Podcast. So without further delay, please welcome an Epic Human, James Wells. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Epic Human Podcast. I would like to welcome James Wells to the show. Hi, James. How are you?
Hey, Joe. Very well. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thanks for coming on the podcast. So James is head of business development at Sanctuary AI, based in Vancouver, Canada. And we've known each other for quite a while now, James. It's been over 5 years now.
And, I think that's right.
We worked together back at a firm called Chrysalix, which is in Vancouver, and you were kind of my VC mentor. You were kind of the wise older associate / VP, and you really took me under your wing and taught me venture. So I do appreciate that.
It was both ways, Joe. It was both ways.
and I also have this fond memory, and you know this is coming, but of. One of the first times we went out, we were at a dinner together. It was actually a dinner hosted by one of the senior partners at the firm, and my wife and I were very young, fresh parents. Had our baby who was like, I don't know, maybe 2 or 3 months old, and you and Jen, your wife, were kind of taking turns holding the baby and being great friends, and we could see that you guys were going to be awesome future parents. But there was this phenomenal moment when you were holding our son Rowan, and all of a sudden you got this weird look on your face, and you kind of said, I think something's happening. I think he went to the bathroom, and I was like, oh no. So I picked him up. I gave him a sniff, and I saw a big stain on your pants. And then I investigated, and I said, "Oh, don't worry, it's just pee. Don't worry." And you gave me this look like, "This is still a problem."
That's a real thing.
And that was the moment I realized I was indeed a parent. My perception of like what is gross had completely changed.
Totally. And now I've got 2 under 2. And I'm knee deep in urine every other morning.
Exactly. You've turned the same corner.
Yeah, no, I totally get it now.
Very good, very good. Well, thanks for indulging me in that trip down memory lane. And so it's been an exciting few months for you. You recently started this role at Sanctuary, and I'd love if you could just kind of give an overview of the company and the vision and your role there.
Sure. Yeah. Happy to. About 3 months now, I left an 8-year career in seed stage venture and joined 2 very impressive and thoughtful founders. One is Jordy Rose, who started D-Wave, which is the first commercially available quantum computer, and then Suzanne Gildert, who started Kindred, which was the first company to launch a reinforcement learning AI hardware product for the e-commerce picking and sorting market. And it's really, my role is really leading up business development to focus on the near-term, high-value, low-complex applications for humanoid robots. So the grand vision is to build human-like machine intelligence. And that's a subset of artificial general intelligence, which you probably hear quite a bit about. And our model to do that is to build ultra-human-like robotic systems. So these are robots that are indistinguishable from humans, physically, emotionally, and cognitively. And so obviously that's a big 10, 20-year vision. And how do we map out our commercial strategy and our commercial roadmap from sort of day 1 to year 10? So it's obviously quite a daunting and super exciting space to be in. And the industries that have shown sort of uptake and traction just in our early conversations are sort of all over the map. So there's applications within financial services, retail, hospitality, therapeutics, and it's really about partnering with long-term, innovative, visionary customers that want to benefit in the event that we're successful of actually creating machine intelligence that is as cognitively equivalent to a human.
super exciting vision. I think for most of us, what comes to mind is Westworld, and obviously that's a highly dramatized version. But what role? So let's take the long view though, just for fun. The long view, how do you see humanoid type robots playing a role in our lives day to day?
Yeah. So if you think about companionship and empathy is sort of at the core of what we're trying to do. So we initially launched something called the Empathy Lab to measure social connection that a human would have for a robot, and then how do you quantify and optimize that. But just bringing it back to the integration of a physical robot that moves and looks like a human, and then layering on affective software, which is basically emotionally intelligent software that can interpret the sentiment from your tone of voice, from the words that you're saying, from your gesticulation, and so it's more about if you've ever seen that movie Her, how we can build these highly engaging, empathic robots to help people through a whole multitude of problems they have on the day-to-day. And, big ones, mental health. Another one is around dementia. So I'll just dive into that for a quick amount of time. The dementia is really challenging mentally and physically for family members and caregivers. And one thing we're focused on is automating social tasks. So a lot of robotics companies are focused on automating repetitive mechanical tasks. And the way we've approached teaching the robot how to engage socially is sort of quite conducive to care of seniors, and particularly seniors with dementia.
And as I understand it, there's you all have a unique perspective or philosophy on how the robotic kind of future artificial intelligence based mind connects with the human body. And because theoretically you could do both of these things, you could decouple those, you could do each of these individually, but you have a specific philosophy on why that needs to happen together, or there's added benefits to doing so.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's our philosophy. It's sort of a long-standing concept in intelligence theory, and it's called embodied cognition. And that is, intelligence arises when a body moves through space, because a body has to navigate uncertain environments day after day after day. And if you think about how our brains evolved, we basically survived long enough to reproduce, and that cycle continued for hundreds of thousands of years. And so we're basically emulating digitally how the human mind evolved. And that is creating, you could call it sort of digitizing the human sensorium. But basically with all the IoT sensors available today, we can recreate through vision and hearing, sense, smell, touch, all that that a human would interpret, and then model that intelligence or that behavior based on those inputs. So we can basically replicate how the human intelligence evolved, and at the end we might uncover a human-like machine intelligence.
Amazing. And can you talk a little bit about the historic success and applications of robotics? Specifically, what I'm getting at is there have been approaches to kind of this fully embodied approach in the past, but there tends to be kind of a regression to the mean around approaching specific applications for robotics, right? So solving a specific task oftentimes doesn't require the full humanoid robot, right? It might just require an arm or a vision system or what have you. Can you just talk about the philosophy or the approach you're taking to kind of realize this goal that's kind of been on our minds collectively as humanity for so long?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question, and something we talk about almost every day, because it's very seductive to map out the product specs and the criteria and build a purpose-built robot. And when you do that, you lose this generality cognitive architecture that we're really trying to do. And so actually the founders went down this path 3 years ago with a company called Kindred. The original intent was to build this general purpose cognitive architecture. And then as they talked to customers and learned about market opportunities in picking and sorting T-shirts in e-commerce warehouses, you required less and less the humanoid form factor, right? So it became no longer mobile. It didn't need a face. It really just needed an arm and a protective casing to enable it to do its job. And then it was rewarded on the number of items it could sort in a period of time. And so it totally just moved away from this general cognitive architecture, which we sort of see as the holy grail. And so we're seeing it again, as we talk to customers, like, well, we just need it to do X or Y. And so the I guess, challenge here is to align both the technical and visionary objectives with what the customer wants. And so that's part of the challenge, these mission-based ventures face. And it takes an extraordinary amount of discipline and focus and commitment from the founders. And Jordy and Suzanne are definitely of that type.
And what do you say to folks who are fearful of AI or are fearful of humanoid robotics? Because a lot of folks have talked about that. Elon's talked about that. A number of others, big name people. How do you all think about it? And what do you say to people who have those fears?
Yeah, there's not a great answer, and our PR budget isn't big enough to convince everyone, and so we're sort of okay with some of the commentary. One of the I'm just trying to say, no one's ever done this before, right? And so the examples that we draw from are all science fiction based, are all in movies, and are typically mostly dystopian. Right? And so people immediately use those references as examples of where this could go. And we're not 100% confident that it will all be rainbows and unicorns. And oftentimes whenever you're sort of pushing the edge of science, you sort of take on some of these ethical and moral challenges based on the transformative nature of a technology. Net, we think it's going to be positive. People, the biggest issue people have is, the replacement of jobs. And, McKinsey did this 100-year study and looked back at 10-year increments of how disruptive technology affected jobs. And in 100% of the time, there was a net growth in jobs. However, in the short term, there was radical job loss. And so, if your horizon is 10 plus years, we think this will be transformative for society and ultimately beneficial.
Yeah, no, I'm a believer in kind of the beneficial impact of technology, as you know, and I tend to not worry so much. I do worry when some of those dislocations happen all of a sudden. So for example, if every truck was turned autonomous, over the course of 6 months, I think that would be devastating. But I think what happens more often, or probably 100% of the time, is that it's more of a slow drip, and it happens more gradually, and it does ideally give people some time to kind of retrain or repurpose themselves. And the other kind of big belief I have, I don't know if you share this, is that I think in the future, automation is going to help folks just create, just be more valuable and use their time on some of the higher level tasks that humans are best at. And again, I think this will be a gradual turn, but even with all of the, I think it might have been that same McKinsey report, even with all of the buzz around automation replacing jobs, I think what's more likely to happen is it replaces specific parts of a job, right? And so it's augmenting human activity in the short, medium term, maybe not in the far distance term, but the vision, or at least the idea of that in the long term, is that it frees us up to do more things we want to do. It makes products and living cheaper, energy cheaper, everything cheaper, and therefore allowing us to live a more abundant life. Is that the way you think about things, or do you have a kind of a different opinion?
Yeah, no, largely the same. I mean, just your point about what is a job, right? It's a bundle of job tasks, and we can offer a lower cost, higher performing element of a job by replacing some of the tasks, and then it's a redistribution of the tasks across the entire workforce, right? So it will be disruptive, but it's not like it's a plug and play robot for a human kind of thing. It'll be a reassignment and redistribution of job tasks that hopefully will offer the employer much cheaper labor with consistent service quality.
Yeah, and I'm kind of intrigued by this idea of universal basic income, and that if we get to this point where and this would probably be more in the long term, but if we get to this point where a lot of the work is being done, and there is some of this dislocation happening, at the end of this kind of transformation, I think a universal basic income could and would probably make sense. I don't know if you've looked at that closely.
Yeah, and I'm kind of going a bit above my pay grade here. I mean, Suzanne, who is sort of the technical and creative genius behind this, has paid a lot of attention to the ethical and moral and sort of what we call post-capitalism implications of this. Because if you can effectively create a piece of software that it can do what a human can do in a humanoid form factor, you can basically do any job in the economy, and at 10% of the cost. And so what are the implications of that? What are the tax implications of that? And there's some big unknowns there.
And just switching gears, what's it been like for you? I mean, you've been in venture for so long. What's it like being on the other side of the table and being at a startup?
Oh, I love it. I mean, first of all, it's a women-led organization. So 2 of the 3 founders are females, and the lead software engineer is a female. And it's a different dynamic. I'd say my last 8 years have all been with white males, and most of the U.S. actually, most of the U.S. white males, even though being in Canada. So there's a different feel there. But also, with these transformative platform plays, you basically have license to have a whole host of conversations with really intelligent people at the VP and C level. And so I've quite enjoyed that. And that reminds me a little bit of, fundraising and going around to different LPs. But, the pitch is similar in that, when you go to an LP, you say, we don't know what we're going to invest in, but we know it's going to be transformative, right? And here are the relationships, and here's why. It's similar at this stage. I mean, we're in early days, and we're making making hypotheses that may or may not play out. And so people are really buying the vision and the team and what we've shown to date. So there's a lot of similarities, and I really enjoy it. I mean, I kind of view myself as, not a VC, not an entrepreneur, but, just an active participant in the venture ecosystem. And there's so many roles wrapped up in that, that I just love this whole space of innovation and working with corporates and entrepreneurs and technologists, it's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, well, we're certainly excited to see where it leads, and I'm sure we could philosophize about the future of robotics and automation all day. But
Totally.
I do want to get to some of your stories and life experiences, because you are a treasure trove of fantastic stories, and so I'd love to jump to those.
Sure.
I signed up for survival school.
Oh yeah. Can you talk about that?
Sure. Yeah. It was an interesting experience right from the get-go, because having grown up in Vancouver and really enjoying the outdoors, I sort of wanted to improve my wilderness skills. And a lot of the classes out there, you sit in a classroom and they kind of draw it out, and then you go out and you practice it. And I found this survival school in Boulder, Utah, called BOSS, Boulder Outdoor Survival School.
Mm-hmm.
And basically they break you down and then have you figure out how to survive. And if you fall, they've kind of got someone there to coach and nudge you, but it's just a very untraditional way to learn very traditional skills. And so there was 9 of us on a 14-week trip with 3 instructors. And basically you go out into the wilderness with no tent, no sleeping bag, largely no food, a blanket that you construct into a backpack. And basically for the first 4 days, you just, walk through the wilderness and don't eat. And they're like, okay, now you're hungry. Now we're going to show you how to make fire without any tools. Now we're going to show you how to, manage your heat and build debris huts and survive overnight. And so basically, it was the first time that I snuggled with men overnight, somewhat complete strangers. And it just doesn't matter, right? Like when you're pushed to those extremes, like the subtleties of being polite and, or the subtleties of politeness just don't really matter. So I bonded with 2 guys, and we built these debris huts, and I was the longest and had the most surface area, so therefore I was in the middle.
And what's a debris hut? What is that?
So it's basically scrounging a lot of the fallen leaves or light dirt that actually has great heat retention value. Mm-hmm. And I mean, it was unbelievable. If you pile these things high enough and you snuggle in with some critters, it acts almost like a down, and just retains the heat. So basically, you'd spend 2 hours framing almost a bed with some logs, and then filling it with leaves, and then basically jumping in and putting your blanket over you. And and depending how cold the other guys were, they'd put their hands right in your pockets and bed down.
Wow. And what is that effectively just trying to simulate the worst case scenario? Like, what's their logic? What's the rationale?
Yeah. So what is it? It's the rule of threes, or no, I forget what the rule is, but basically, if you find yourself in a situation where you've got to survive, what do you do? And a couple of takeaways for me is you can walk a really long way with basically no food. So like if you're off a trail or whatever, I mean, you can basically walk back to civilization. I'm just trying to remember the rule of threes. I think it was, if you find yourself in a situation, you got 3 seconds to check your body for any life ending cuts or wounds, and then you've got 3 minutes to sort of calm your mind, and then you've got 3 hours to regulate your heat, so make sure you're not too cold or too hot, and then you've got 3 days to find water. That's typically how long you can go without water, and then you got 3 weeks to go that you can go without food, and then 3 months is kind of when you start to lose your mind. If you're totally alone in the woods, if you've seen Castaway, where Tom Hanks befriends that softball or that volleyball, that's actually what they recommend you do. Like, make friends with the sticks and the squirrels.
Really?
Yeah, we're social beings, man.
Wow.
But yeah, I mean, and then for the food, so we went 4 days without food, and they gave us a banana, and I will never forget that banana. I basically like rubbed it on my face, like peeled the inner peel with my teeth. You know, that rind that you never eat?
Yeah.
I mean, you just suck it for all it's worth. And the amazing thing was I was full after that because my stomach had shrunk so much. I mean, you're just so adaptable. And then we basically got a handful of trail mix for each day until day 9, which then they brought out a sheep that we slaughtered, cooked up its blood, skinned it, butchered it, cooked up the meat, baked bread in the stomach, and basically wasted nothing, right? So we made a pelt out of the skin. And then the last 2 days, you kind of went out on your own to practice the skills, right? So can you make a fire? Can you make your own debris hut? And that's a time for self-reflection when you're completely alone, haven't showered. And it's just so gratifying to start a fire from literally nothing. And I just remember having no open loops in my mind, like no to-do items, no worries really. It was just a very pure time, and we'll get into how that affected some of my future activities. But
what was 2 questions? What was the hardest part, and then what were some of your big takeaways from that experience?
Hardest part was caring about other people. There was 9 of us, right? And we were a group, and there was this guy who had done who had done 2 terms in Iraq, and he had U.S. military training, and he was all about making sure the group was okay, and would always tend to the laggard. And I guess the belief is leave no man behind. And he was unbelievable. Like, he would sacrifice himself for the group. And I just looked at this guy like, I must be a selfish person, because I am basically holding on a thread here, just trying to like put one foot in front of the other.
Right.
And here you are, like, totally leading the group. So I guess that was more of a takeaway than one of the more challenging things. But
but it was hard it was hard. I mean, normally in our lives we at least have the opportunity to think about others. How are others feeling? How can we do that? But you're saying in a survival situation, your lizard brain kicks in, and you're just like, I need food, I need shelter. Like, let's not worry about everybody else until we get our basic needs covered.
Yeah, exactly. And what ended up happening, I rolled my ankle on like day 10. So I was the weakest link.
Oh no!
And had to depend on people, and it killed me because I didn't want to sort of be the laggard. But I made some pretty strong connections. I'd say one of the key takeaways is knowledge is really light, right? So if you understand what to do out there, you don't need a tent, you don't need a cook stove and all this other stuff. So you can actually traverse land much more efficiently, and sort of knowing that in my bones kind of thing, because I learned it in a state where you're quite not desperate, but it's a pretty uncomfortable time. And then just resiliency, right? I mean, I sort of surprised I think the group surprised themselves, just, what we could do and how far we could go. And, by the end, we were all still laughing and, yeah.
And you lost some weight, right? I mean, most people probably lost some weight as going through that experience.
Yeah. I think I lost 12 pounds in 14 days.
Yeah.
And then literally in 2 days gained it all back.
Really? Okay.
I can remember. So this was in Utah, right? So we went, and the closest town was Provost, which is a very traditional Mormon town, and the gay pride was in that town. The gay pride parade was in that town the day we got back. And I just remember, you come out of just not seeing another human for 14 days and then coming into this, and I was thinking, oh, what's going on here? Like, has the world totally turned upside down? But no, I remember that distinctly, and the food. Went to a restaurant, and one of those all-you-can-eat soft serve places, and I remember telling the guy what I had just done. He was like, "Oh, dude, it's on the house. Like, eat as much as." Like, oh.
Oh, that's fantastic. And okay, where to go next? There's so many good stories here. Let's go to well, you mentioned that some of this soul searching led to some other decisions. So I'll let you kind of guide us as to where did that take you? Because you've undergone a few transformations, a few had some unique experiences from there. But was this what led you to some of those things, or was it more disjointed?
I think it helped. So yeah, just putting pause on the career, the spending a lot of time by yourself or with a group in the outdoors sort of tipped me off to this whole mindfulness movement.
Right.
And this was 4 years ago, and that was sort of interesting. That scratched a bit of an itch, but I really didn't buy it. I mean, this whole idea of sitting in an urban environment and clearing your mind. I struggled with it. So I went to silent retreats, and I read books about it, and I sort of elevated my understanding about it. But ultimately, I found it was really helpful in sort of de-stressing and bringing focus in a calm, quiet environment, which we live our lives not in that environment, right? I mean, I think we all have stressful jobs and deadlines and big projects, and what I'm sort of noodling on in my head now is ambition. Like, ambition breeds stress, right? And so, is there a way to sort of balance, a peaceful mindset with extreme ambition? And so I sort of came up with this experiment, and that was to, practice mindfulness in an extremely uncomfortable situation. And so I chose to do an Ironman without any training other than yoga and practicing mindfulness, and to see and to test this and to really explore what mindfulness could be, in a challenging environment.
And so you had done some shorter triathlons, and you had done some yoga, but you were not an expert at either of these things. This was a real reach for you.
Yeah. So I've never run a marathon, which is what you have to do in Ironman, and certainly never swam the 4 kilometers you got to do in an Ironman. I had done quite a bit of cycling, just around town, and then. So I had some familiarity with that, but yeah, certainly not at those distances.
And so walk us through that journey. You set this kind of somewhat outrageous type of goal, and lots of people thought you were crazy. And how much time did you give yourself? And then tell us about your regiment, your yoga regiment.
Yeah. Disciplined yoga training.
Yeah.
So I was kind of going back and forth with it with my wife, and she said, "Well, why don't you get or think about getting a sponsor?" So I actually, it was sort of serendipitous in that I had to give a presentation at a building, and in that building was the head office of Canada's largest yoga company. And so I thought, okay, I'll just go check it out. So I gave my presentation. I went down there and I was explaining my concept to the secretary, like, yeah, I'll just do yoga and then I'll do an Ironman. And she didn't really get it. She's like, so you're going to do like a downward dog during the run? Like, I don't really get it. And there was some guy in the back cubicle, like, stood up and cheered. He was like, that's the great idea. So anyway, I got in front of the CEO and he decided to sponsor it, which is basically free yoga and some support with some yoga teachers. But basically their business is mostly driven by female guests. And so they wanted to show that, not only is this, helpful for men, but could play a role in sports. So he was actually quite supportive. And it was going to be 90 days of doing yoga every day. And sometimes I did it twice a day or even 9 times a day, I think was the record. And then on the 90th day, I do an Ironman. Wow. And I needed some sport specific training because, so for example, the swim, you got to swim in a wetsuit. I've never really done that. So I bought a wetsuit. Mm-hmm. And then the bike is 180 kilometers. And, if you're off, if your posture or your positioning's off a little bit, I think I calculated it was like 50,000 revolutions of your wheel. And so that adds up. So I had my bike custom fit to my super awkward lean frame. And then running, like no one just runs a marathon without doing any running. But I found these shoes that are for trail runners that run, 100 kilometers, and they literally made me 2 inches taller because of the padding. But that was the only savior to kind of restrict all the joint impact.
This is the Hoka shoes.
The Hoka.
Yeah. You're I know a number of people who live by those.
I will never buy another running shoe other than it is unbelievable. So I ended up doing 14 hours, full disclosure, of sport specific training, usually with someone who was quite well versed in that sport. But most people will train 6 months to a year, doing 14-hour training weeks.
Sure.
So I was at a bit of a disadvantage, but that's kind of what I wanted, right? Like I didn't want to wreck my body. Yeah. And what ended up happening is yoga is amazing for toning and strengthening, your ligaments. And I was very flexible. I actually, depends where you want to take this conversation, but there was actually some really clear benefits of what yoga can do for the triathlete.
Yeah, please tell us about the day. Tell us about the benefits, the drawbacks.
Yeah. So the experiment was not to win Ironman. Obviously, it was just to finish. And so you've got 17 hours, and each event has a cutoff time. So basically, I had to go fast enough to meet those cutoff times, but slow enough that I could survive 17 hours. And so yoga, my idea was, well, if I just work really hard in yoga, I can get my heart rate up high enough so that it translates into a speed that I can meet these hurdle rates in the Ironman. And so I took yoga really seriously, like
clearly.
Yeah. And, diet is the fourth sport in triathlon. So people were saying, well, you gotta, tune your body to what you're going to eat. So I was in yoga, with those gel tabs and with power bars, and people were like, it's a 1 hour class, buddy. Like, you're going to be okay. But I would do silly things. Like I'd go to hot yoga for back-to-back classes. So I'd be quite dehydrated because how do you emulate a 17-hour day doing yoga, right? It's pretty hard. You just do a lot of yoga classes back-to-back. And so that's what I did. So when the day came, I felt really, really good. And, talking to folks who have done Ironman, they said you usually show up and, you've been training and there's a lingering pain in the joints or the muscle. And, I didn't have any of that. I had basically prepared my body to take just a lot of discomfort and pain. And leading up, I should say, I also meditated every day for usually about 20 minutes. And the mindfulness practice changed a little bit too. And I think this is important to talk about. Mm-hmm. In a traditional meditation, you know, I'm sure you're familiar with this, but you basically have an anchor, and that's your breath. Mm-hmm. And when your mind gets distracted, you bring it back to the anchor. Your mind gets distracted, you bring it back to the anchor. But I found the distractions were really distracting, like emotionally vexing, that I had to kind of ditch the anchor and just spend time dwelling with whatever that, I called them kind of psychic knots, right? And so just like you would relax a physical muscle by applying pressure to it, I would do that with some of these mental and emotional knots that would sort of come up when I was sitting there meditating. And so it was sort of this two-step practice where, you know, I clear the mind, and then something I could not ignore or I felt was, you know, unchecked, or there was an open loop that I just sort of dwell. And, you know, weird stuff came up from like high school, and, you know, decisions and regrets and all this stuff. But eventually it all kind of just became this very calm state where those things didn't come up anymore. So when I was in Ironman, I did that exact practice. So my breath was the anchor, and I'd bring it back to the breath, because, you know, your mind's like, are you an idiot? Like you're really going to do this? you're probably not going to finish. And what are you going to tell people? And you know, I mean, all these doubts.
Sure.
And so I would, you know, spend time like not just sort of dwelling in those thoughts, but it was more physical pain that would come up. So with the swim, for example, after 2 kilometers, my arms felt like they were going to totally fall off. Like I couldn't really feel them anymore. Mm-hmm. But instead of grinning and bearing it and, you know, fighting through, I sort of embraced the pain and relaxed into it, if that makes sense. And so my heart rate, I had a target heart rate that I had translated into a pace that would allow me to finish. But basically, relaxing into the pain was kind of quite successful for me.
Sure, and that's what yoga's great at. I mean, that's part of the practice of yoga, is feeling the pain and breathing through it, relaxing through it, getting comfortable with it.
Exactly.
So it's interesting that translates so well to Ironman.
Yeah. And so I completed the swim, and I'm touching down the sand and thinking, okay, I can do this. I had a swagger in my step at that point. And of course, very mindfully, and, you know, walked into the change tent and took a deep breath and, you know, took it all in. And I realized at that time, you know, everyone's frantically trying to get into their biking uniform to get on the bike. And here I was, you know, peacefully making eye contact with all these naked men trying to hustle out the tent. And I was like, oh, I'm totally the pervert here.
But that's the best feeling coming out of the swim, because you're like, okay, my arms can rest. Now it's all legs.
Legs.
And you're getting out of the water, so you feel fantastic. So, okay. And so then the bike ride.
So then the bike ride, and my theory was, well, if I get tired, I'll just coast. But of course, it was in Whistler, which I'm now told has the highest elevation difference of any Ironman race, and so it's quite hilly through the mountains. And that was a challenge. It was more the headwinds that you'd get, but a great place to just be in your body and just feel. And it was quite interesting. Throughout the race, there's drop bags, and you know, different people write notes that I didn't read ahead of time that I'd read out on the race. And my wife had written, be in the moment as if you had chosen it. And that sort of forces you to take ownership of your situation. And for whatever reason, really just sort of pits you against the challenge. And I found that quite helpful. But anyways,
wise words from Jen, who's a wonderful woman. And she also packed you some special snack, I believe.
Yeah, yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah, that I decided to just, I mean, I didn't know at the time, but that was on the run portion.
Oh, okay.
And
Go ahead.
yeah, I ended up just running right by it and not needing it in the end. But
Okay.
yeah. And then, yeah, so I was at 10 hours, I think, when I started the marathon. And coming off the bike, I can remember my hip flexors pretty much saying stop, right? Like that was pretty painful. But again, just sort of bringing it back to the breath and then being right there with the hip flexors for the majority of the race. And it was a 2-lap race, and I can remember, I ended up finishing at sort of 15 hours, and at hour 13, you kind of get the zombie march. There's a lot of people who with their heads slunk over and they're kind of dragging their feet. And I have to say, I felt great. Like I was so pumped because I was going to finish, and I felt just so empowered. And yeah, and then there was a bear. We ran into a bear with 2 cubs.
What?
Yeah. And then I realized, I don't have to outrun the bear. I've just got to outrun this guy beside me. And they had to move the whole course. Yeah, I remember that now.
Wow.
So at about 14 hours and 50 minutes, I came around the last bend. And, if you talk to anyone finishing Ironman, it is a euphoric experience. It is unbelievable. Just the feeling. And it turns out that my wife had a friend whose husband was the announcer at the finish line. And so she had sort of told him the preamble. And so when I came into the chute, which is about a 500-meter stretch where everyone is, cheering, and there's the announcer, he had sort of given the backstory and was like, yeah, this guy who was just at yoga, and so people went crazy, or at least what I thought was crazy. And I tell you, man, it was such a moment. Like I totally cried. And
wow.
There's a picture that Jen got captured of me, and I'm not sure I'll be ever that euphoric again. It was, there's a few moments in life, and it was luckily captured by the camera. And then right before the finish line, I did a downward dog. and stretched it out and closed it out. Yeah.
Amazing. Wow. Yeah. What a story.
Yeah.
Incredible. And man,
would I do it again? Probably not.
Well, why not? I mean, like, what was your takeaway from that? I mean, it sounds like it was in the end a hugely positive experience for you, but
yeah.
Explain.
Yeah, I'd probably seek out, and I did, another mindfulness physical challenge. That's not the Ironman. Like I don't think I could ever replicate that. I mean, so many things came together. The day and my diet, and people opened up their houses where we got to stay in Whistler, and it was literally like a Cinderella storybook. And so after that, my friend was like, "Look, I'm doing a 50-kilometer trail run in the fall in the mountains. Do you want to come with me?" And I was like, "Hell yeah, I'll do that. I mean, I don't need to train, and I can do these things." And I made the mistake of showing up without a jacket. And so I went to the grocery store and I bought a jacket, and ended up finishing this race. And it took me 9 hours. I was literally the last person. And I'm not a masochist, honestly, but the last like 200 meters, I kind of, they were shutting down the event, and they were going to go out on a reverse trail to look for me, and kind of came hobbling out of the woods, and Jen totally broke down, just because I was in this state of almost hypothermia. So it, I kind of like, those sort of events, but I'm not sure I'd do Ironman.
Quite the contrast to the different experience.
Yeah, exactly. Nobody's at the finish line, and your wife's crying instead of cheering. Yeah, yeah, great.
I was thinking as you were talking about the Ironman, when you said the fear of telling people I failed at this, And I wonder if like one of the benefits of setting such a crazy goal is that everyone thinks you're not going to be successful anyway.
Yeah.
And so if you fail, it's kind of like, well, I just met everyone's expectations. But if I succeed, wow, are people going to be shocked?
Totally. And that's why, setting goals should move the needle. Like if you know you're going to finish, it's not really a challenge.
Yeah.
Right. Like it's like, oh yeah, that was kind of expected. But honestly, I had doubts throughout the whole thing, and the sort of mindfulness and sitting with those thoughts and working through those thoughts was so much a part of this that doesn't really come out in the experience. But basically, coming back to this peaceful ambition kind of concept, I mean, how do you take on these ridiculously ambitious projects but not get eaten up in the insecurity and the stress, and how do you manage that throughout the journey? And this kind of two-step process is something I've been applying, and I have no idea if it works for other people, but I seem to have found a practice that's helpful for me.
Well, it's not for the faint-hearted, and but it seems to have had a big effect on you, and and I can definitely see the benefits. But let me ask you this: is it the type of thing where you do it once, you're transformed, you have a new insight, and you can apply it going forward, or is it the type of thing that the benefits, whether spiritual, mentally, fade, and you have to kind of keep challenging yourselves in interesting ways? And how have you thought about that?
Oh yeah, it's totally the latter. I mean, it's a muscle, right? It's a mental muscle that you've got to keep up and train. That sort of became evident when we had our first kid, because the no time to practice meditation in those first few months, and just being aware of that, I noticed that change, that some of those thoughts and feelings would sort of creep back in. I think for me, like one thing I'm pretty cognizant of doing is, there's a lot of great advice out there, but it's hard to actually own it unless you really dwell and own it. And so for me, it was, okay, this mindfulness thing has a role, can be impactful, and it's something I'm going to dedicate a lot of my, precious time to going forward. That was sort of, I guess, the main takeaway, that there is something here, and it's it can be pretty impactful.
The other cool thing about it, I think, I'm just thinking aloud right now, is that there was an experimentation aspect to it. And what I kind of hear you saying is you kind of had to make it your own. Like, you get some basic principles, but then you have to figure out, okay, how's this going to work for me, and how am I going to experiment? And I think that makes it work for an individual, and it makes it more mentally interesting, because there's so much advice out there about, okay, totally. Here's how early you should wake up in the morning. Here's how you should meditate. Here's how you should exercise. Here's how you should eat. And I think part of it is figuring out what works for you personally. And the only way to figure out what works for you personally is to try a bunch of stuff, and do A/B testing on your own body and your own psyche, and to constantly be challenging. And the hard part about that is you're experimenting in real time, and there's also the tension to that is there's also value to consistency, right? You have to do something for a certain amount of time before you can assess how it's working. So it's like this insane multivariable challenge. So it's interesting the way you've addressed it by just setting a crazy, like, totally new type of goal or experience or application of a basic set of foundational principles.
Yeah, I like how you framed that. I mean, for me, I'm not sure I'd be motivated to try it otherwise, right? It sort of has to have this element of large, somewhat risky appetite, kind of like venture, right? It sort of had to have that element to keep me consistent and curious and trying things.
I'm also intrigued by something you said earlier about the mental knots and the different types of meditation. I had an experience that was somewhat similar, a realization that was similar, when I started to do tanks. What am I thinking of?
Tanks.
Submersion tanks or immersion tanks.
Oh, like floating?
Float tanks, yeah. Let me start over.
Yeah.
I had a similar experience or realization when I started experimenting with float tanks.
Yeah, I think I remember that.
Because what would happen is I would get into the tank and I would say, okay, clear the mind, focus on the breath. Okay, oh wait, there's this thing that came up that's been really bothering me. Okay, I'm going to try not to think about that. Going to think about it for a little while. Mm-hmm. Maybe 2 or 3 minutes have passed. Okay, there's another thing. I'm going to think about that for 2 or 3 minutes. Okay, mm-hmm. And then and the normal float tank time period was 60 minutes. And so I would be thinking that about 15 minutes had passed, and then the light would go on, the thing would bling, the beep would chime or whatever it was, and it would say, 60 minutes is up. And I'm like, are you kidding me? That much time has already passed.
Yeah,
and I spent all of my time thinking about all the things I was trying to not think about. But the craziest part is once I got out, I got showered, got my clothes on, I would just sit there and have some tea, for a few minutes before I left. But my mind at that point was totally calm. Like it was like I had done all the hard work, and it was kind of like getting a massage. Like it was incredibly painful, but afterwards I was calm, I was peaceful, and I'd worked out my demons in some way.
Yeah, that's a great way to frame it. Working out your demons. One of the guys I go to every year who puts on a bit of a clinic, he calls it archaeology of the heart. And so, like an archaeologist, you're kind of sweeping away layers and layers and layers and layers until you get to like the real critical hard stuff. And I would find like a lot of the noise is more, it's just sort of practical open loops of to-do items and whatnot. But like the stuff that can really hold you back, the walls or the emotional challenges, that is sort of, once you work that out, it is like weights have been lifted off your shoulder. It's really, it's kind of a very healing process.
And so speaking of, you mentioned earlier having to invent new challenges for yourself to keep those muscles strong. You and Jen had a child, and then you decided to set an ambitious goal in terms of your travel plans. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Oh yeah. So in terms of keeping things interesting, yes, having a child, that is a great challenge, not to be underestimated. But that
wasn't enough for you.
Well, yeah. I mean, in Canada, we have quite good paternity leave benefits. Mm-hmm. And actually, my wife was a contractor, so could not take maternity leave. And so the paternity leave benefits accrued to me. And so we took 3 months off and went to New Zealand. And basically lived in a van for a third of it, and then was on farms for about a third of it, where you kind of earn your keep, and then a third of just touring around at different Airbnbs and whatnot.
With your newborn child? With
our newborn child, yeah. I mean, he was probably 6 months then.
Okay.
Yeah, right? Like have a under 1-year-old in a camper van for 6 weeks. You learn all valuable team working skills and get to know your kid pretty intimately.
And what inspired that? Because I think, again, a lot of people would say or would feel, okay, we just had a child, our everything's crazy, maybe we get some time off, maybe we don't, but let's just nest, let's just go from here, from our our home to the coffee shop and back.
Yeah.
You know, what inspired this idea?
Yeah. So it's important to have context. So Jen and I are both were both travelers before. So you know, she lived 2 years in South Africa and traveled around Africa quite a bit. I had backpacked independently for 6 months through South America, and traveled in lots of places. So we kind of want to pass that on to the next generation. Now I realize you don't have to do that when they're a baby, right? There's lots of time to impart this trait, but really it was January, and it's really dark and oh no, it wasn't. It was it was January, which is dark and cold in Canada. And if you go to the other side of the hemisphere, it's a lot sunnier. And so that was kind of the gist of it. And then we're big campers. But you know, toting around a tent and setting that up and down, and it just kind of landed on a camper van, which actually is great because when the kids got a nap, boom, you got his bed. He's hungry, boom, you got his food right there. It's like a portable house. It's it actually worked out really, really well. And as a parent, you'll know planning is and trying to show up places on time is sort of impossible. And so we could just go with the flow. And you know, depending on weather and location, we'd hunker down or move on. It was actually extremely liberating. You know, not having to be anywhere, being a fully self-sufficient unit, and you know, I had my survival skills. So
right,
we'd be just fine.
If the camper breaks down, honey, don't worry. I can make a debris hut.
Yeah, I'll invite you into my debris hut. Yeah. We'll give the kid the banana. Yeah.
Amazing. That's incredible. And is there something in the Canadian spirit around travel? I've kind of noticed this. For some reason, having lived both places, I feel that Canadians have just more of an attraction or a comfort with travel, whereas in the U.S., I feel like people are either more fearful or maybe there's just more places to visit without leaving the country. Can you just talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I'm not sure I have great feedback. I mean, there's always the joke that Americans, when they go overseas, sew on a Canadian flag on their bags, right? So they come across, and maybe there's some of that, but I think it's more about the individual. I've certainly met a lot of Americans abroad. I don't know, because I mean, look, there's a lot of Canadians that don't travel, and the majority of my friends who have kids are like, this is the dumbest decision of your life to go. Or, you have no idea. And so no, I think it's balance, and it's, you know, more a function of who you hang out with. Maybe, I don't know.
Gotcha. Yeah, I have a feeling. I mean, sure, there's definitely a range on both sides, but I have a feeling, and maybe this flag issue is just Canadians are less fearful when they go abroad because they're more welcomed or neutral. And you're right. There's certainly many Americans that travel. I just feel like for some reason there's just not as much of a zest for like let me travel all over the place and let me, you know, take off a year and travel. It's just not a huge part of the culture here for some reason. I haven't really nailed it down, but it's just a subtle nuance that I've noticed just having lived both places. And again, I could be wrong, but that's just my perception.
Yeah, because you've traveled quite a bit, haven't you?
Yeah, a bit. I mean, I would say it's just not as fundamental to my being somehow. But I don't know, that can change and flux with stage of life and what have you.
Totally.
Wow, would like to move into the rapid fire section of the podcast to put you in the hot seat.
Okay.
So let me ask you this question. It's one of my favorite questions. What do you believe that others do not?
I think people might be more fulfilled if they were more uncomfortable. I've always found uh, a stretch of time that is not traditionally seen as comfortable. There's always an inflection point after that. So if that's true, why would you not seek out uncomfortable situations? Does that make sense?
It does, and I tend to agree, but I think it's a matter of degree. I feel like because I would agree. I think a lot of, let's put it this way. I think a lot of people would agree generally, but I think you've done a great job of taking it to a greater, extreme, and I think with more extreme benefits. So I think you're a good role model for this.
Yeah, and I want to preface it a little bit. I mean, obviously, I'm very fortunate to be able to pick and choose those circumstances, right? Like in so many lives, there's just really not that opportunity. But I found as you kind of push through some of those uncomfortable feelings or situations, there's always gold on the other side. I mean, yeah, it's always seems to be worthwhile.
And how do you besides some of these like big events, how do you manifest that in your day to day?
So the one thing that a mindfulness practice does is makes you hyper aware of your thoughts, right? And it allows you to sort of remember that. And so there's opportunities to practice things that make you uncomfortable, right? Don't say that, or, why would you do that? But instead of just being caught up in your instincts, you're actually aware of, like, this is the moment, this is an opportunity to say that thing and push the boundary a little bit. So there's kind of like little micro opportunities, I guess, that I can do that. And even, with relationships and opportunities to, talk through things or bring up things that are uncomfortable. It's really just practicing those little opportunities as well.
Gotcha. The way I've been experimenting with this is waking up early. So this year I've been waking up insanely early and doing my workouts like very first thing in the day.
Nice. Good for you.
And I've been very consistent with it, and it's been quite rewarding. But even after having done it for 10, 11 months now, it is still hard. And if I skip a day, if I accidentally sleep in, or if I am sick or whatnot, there's a momentum, and it's hard to go back to it, right? Once you get in the groove of something, it's easy to keep going, but once you slip out of it, getting back into it and re-strengthening that muscle is extremely challenging.
Totally. How do you feel like the moment you wake up? Because that's like the moment, right?
Yeah.
That you either sleep in or
what's... I mean, I feel like I want to go back to sleep. But and in the early days, it was very hard. It was I would feel terrible for basically the whole day. But then after a couple weeks, I just got into it, and I would only feel terrible for the first 5 or 10 minutes, and then I would get into a workout and start feeling really good. And then there was this great feedback loop of I feel good, so I have a better attitude and mindset for the day. And then the big problem with working out for me has been, I try to work out at a certain time of the day, but things come up and they get in the way, or they make me push it to the next day or whatnot. And I did experiment with some mindfulness meditation in the mix or in addition, but I found that for me personally, I could do some of the mindfulness while I was exercising, and I could also do some of the mindfulness while I was doing other things, like while I was cleaning dishes or while I was in the shower. Like I could just start breathing. I could get into that mindset without without having this nagging feeling like, okay, you're wasting time. Like this is 10 minutes. You could be doing something else practical, which is, I think is a flaw of mine because I can't, or I shouldn't say I can't. I'm challenged in doing that and sitting quietly for 10 minutes because I have these nagging feelings. But I found a way, per our earlier conversation, of experimenting in new ways that happen to work for me, may not work for other people, but happen to work for me. And it's been great. I mean, it's changed my life, and I hope I can continue doing it.
That sounds great. And to me, that's sort of the end goal of mindfulness, that it is integrated into your day and you're practicing throughout the day, right? I'm sort of with you, the whole like sitting there for 20 minutes. It's a great entry point, but I don't think it's the be all end all.
Yeah, well, it's great to hear someone else say that because you kind of feel sometimes I kind of feel like I'm on an island when I have thoughts like that. So I appreciate that. Let me ask you this: you're a elder gentleman now at this point to certain demographics. So the question would be, what advice would you give to a young person? Maybe they're in college, maybe they're right out of college, trying to figure out what they want to do. What advice would you give to that person?
Basically, try as many things as you can to figure out what you don't really resonate with. And to do that, you're going to have to do a lot of unpaid things that require a lot of initiative, but you're gonna narrow down the things that I think you're gonna value and find important to spend the majority of your life on. I really struggled with that. I really didn't know what I was going to do, right until kind of my early 20s.
And what do you mean? What do you mean unpaid things? Like, are you saying you should kind of volunteer for things, or you should do things on your own? Like, what do you mean?
Yeah. Volunteer. I mean, if you volunteer, you can get into leadership roles that no one would ever pay you to do because you have no experience, but it's volunteer. And so you can cut your teeth in that regard. And that's sports, that's extracurricular, that's causes, that's whatever. And then also, you can get paid as well. Thinking back, I had so many ridiculous jobs through my teenage years that I learned a lot about what I was good at and what I wasn't. And so much I think, and could be totally wrong here, but people carefully craft, their career path just from the input and from their parents and their friends. They don't actually get out there and try different things. And, your dad was a fisherman doesn't mean you need to be a fisherman, but you probably are going to end up a fisherman because that's where the most influences are, right? I just think exposing yourself to a lot of different stuff is helpful. And if you make that the metric you track, like in a year, you can get involved in 30, 40, 50 things. That would usually take an unfocused person, 5 years to have all those conversations. Can you accelerate that? Totally.
I mean, I think I agree, and I think it's especially important the earlier in life as possible. Just because people do spend years of their life studying a subject they don't care about, or working in a field they hate, and they got into it because they thought it was something else. So I think gathering that data as early as possible, whether it's on your own as an individual or as a parent, kind of exposing your kid to different things, I think is incredibly useful and practical. And a great example is how neither you nor I really knew what engineering was until we got into it. We're like, oh, what's this?
What is this crazy field? Yeah.
Let's say you could put a billboard up in Vancouver or any major city, and it could just say one phrase, one quote, something like that, what would you want to put up?
Well, marijuana would be the obvious choice now in Canada, but I think someone's thought of that billboard already. Wow, so a broadcast message to the city.
To the world.
I feel that there's not enough urgency around climate change. Mm-hmm. With the fires in California, people in other fields are kind of nodding their head. But like, if you had a very intelligent raving lunatic pounding the table that was in the news every day about climate change, I feel like it would be a bit more top of mind and people would start to really embrace some of the issues. And I heard a quote that we're the last generation to realize this, we're the first generation to realize this, and the last generation to do anything about it. I think if I could broadcast the message, it would be like, look, the climate risks are going after your grandkids.
Yeah, it's the greatest challenge of our time, and and it was made pretty real for us here in San Francisco. I mean,
totally.
We effectively could not take our kids outside to play for 2 weeks, and that brought it home. I mean, of course, hearts and prayers, thoughts and prayers go out to the people who were actually very close to the fires and had to deal with the actual fire and destroying their homes and whatnot. But even many dozens or hundreds of miles away, dealing with the smoke has been challenging for people living in the city, and it feels like an indication of what's to come, and it feels like this is becoming the new normal. I mean, just within a matter of days, you saw everybody on the streets wearing masks, and we as a species are highly adaptable. But so I think in a lot of ways we'll be okay. We'll adapt. But at the same time, it's not an environment that we want to live in, and it's not an environment we want our kids to live in. And it feels scary when it feels like there's no escaping it. And so I hear you.
Oh yeah, the new normal, that is scary.
Yeah. Well, awesome, man. This has been fantastic. This has exceeded my expectations dramatically for my already high expectations for this conversation. Well, James, really enjoyed having you on the podcast today. Just final question is, where can people find you and Sanctuary and follow up on all the exciting things you're doing?
Yeah, best bet is sanctuary.ai is our website, and you can follow our Twitter feed, sanctuary_AI on Twitter. And then if people are interested to have more of a conversation, I'm very active on LinkedIn, so James G. Wells on LinkedIn.
Excellent. Well, I'm sure you'll get a few pings from the listeners. Once again, James, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's been a pleasure being your friend and colleague over the past years, and I'm really excited for what you're doing. So thanks again.
Yeah, thanks, Joe.
Thanks for listening to today's episode of the Epic Human Podcast. Today's episode was brought to you by SBZ Legal, a boutique law firm based in Oakland, California, that specializes in working with early-stage startups. Having met all of the individuals at this organization, I can attest that they not only talk the talk, they really walk the walk. And you couldn't ask for a more down-to-earth, mission-oriented group of people. Highly recommend. And if you enjoyed today's episode, please follow us on Twitter or Facebook at Epic Human Pod. And if you liked today's episode, I would ask that you like and subscribe. And if you love today's episode, I would ask that you give us a rating and a review, good or bad. It really just helps to make the podcast better. So until next time, we will look forward to seeing you on the next episode of the Epic Human Podcast.